The autumn wind swept across the hills of rural Tennessee like a mournful whisper, carried with the scent of decaying leaves and forgotten dreams. Harold Beckett stood alone on his porch, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, staring at the endless stretch of land that had once been his father's pride and was now his prison. At 62 years old, Harold had buried more than most men could bear. His wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 3 years now, taken by a cancer that spread faster than wildfire through dry brush. His only son, Michael, had left for the city a decade ago and never looked back, not even for his mother's funeral. The farm that had sustained 4 generations of Beckett's was crumbling, the debts mounting like storm clouds on the horizon, and Harold had begun to wonder if there was any reason left to wake up each morning. He had stopped going to church, stopped returning calls from concerned neighbors, stopped believing that life had anything left to offer a man who had given everything and received only heartbreak in return. But fate has a way of intervening when hope has all but vanished. It was on a night when the moon hung low and orange over the Tennessee hills that Harold first saw him, a magnificent black horse standing at the edge of his property, coat gleaming like polished obsidian under the pale light. The animal had no saddle, no bridle, no markings of ownership. He simply stood there, watching Harold with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom and infinite patience. Harold tried to ignore the horse. He told himself it was a stray, that someone would come looking for it, that it would wander off by morning. But the black horse remained, day after day, week after week, never straying far from the farm, never demanding anything, yet always present. And then came the night that changed everything. The night the black horse walked up to Harold's porch, nudged him with a velvet muzzle, and began walking toward the dark forest at the edge of his property, stopping every few feet to look back, as if urging the old farmer to follow. Against every instinct, against every rational thought in his tired mind, Harold followed. The horse led him through thickets and across streams, deeper into woods Harold hadn't explored in 40 years, until they reached something that made his blood run cold. An old cabin, hidden beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, its windows dark and its door hanging open like a wound. And from inside came a sound that made Harold Beckett step back in horror, a sound that would unravel secrets buried for decades and force him to confront a truth that would either destroy him or finally set him free. This story is about more than a farmer and a horse. It's about the moments that break us, the connections that save us, and the courage it takes to face the ghosts of our past. If you believe in second chances and healing and in the mysterious bond that form between humans and animals, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that like button. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories from the heartland to people who need them. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been led somewhere by fate, by an animal, a stranger, or a feeling you couldn't explain? We want to hear your story. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let me take you on a journey to the hills of Tennessee, where a lonely farmer and a black horse are about to discover that some secrets refuse to stay buried. The Beckett farm had once been the heartbeat of Carter County. Neighbors would drive miles just to see the golden wheat fields swaying in the summer breeze, to buy Eleanor's famous apple preserves at the roadside stand, to watch young Michael ride his bicycle down the dusty lane, while Harold waved from atop his tractor. Those days felt like photographs from someone else's life now, faded, distant, belonging to a man Harold no longer recognized. The farmhouse had fallen into disrepair, not from poverty alone, but from apathy. What was the point of fixing a broken shutter when there was no one to notice? Why mend the fence when the cattle had been sold off 2 winters ago to pay the medical bills? Harold moved through his days like a ghost haunting his own existence, eating when he remembered, sleeping when exhaustion overtook him, speaking to no one because there was no one left who cared to listen. His nearest neighbor, Ruth Calloway, had stopped bringing casseroles months ago. She'd told him, in her gentle but direct way, that she couldn't keep watching him disappear. "You're choosing to die, Harold," she'd said, standing on his porch with tears in her eyes, "and I won't be a witness to it." He hadn't argued. He hadn't even responded. He'd simply closed the door and returned to his chair by the window, where he spent most of his hours staring at nothing. The black horse appeared on a Thursday. Harold remembered because Thursday had been Eleanor's favorite day, the day she baked bread and filled the house with warmth and the scent of yeast and honey. He'd been sitting on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills, when movement at the tree line caught his attention. At first, he thought it was a deer, or perhaps a shadow playing tricks on his aging eyes. But then the creature stepped forward, and Harold's breath caught in his throat. The horse was enormous, easily 17 hands, with a coat so black it seemed to absorb the fading light. His mane flowed like dark water, and his eyes, Lord, those eyes, held a depth that made Harold's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. The animal stood perfectly still, watching him, as if waiting for something. "Go on now," Harold called out, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Ain't nothing for you here." The horse didn't move. Harold pushed himself up from his chair, his knees protesting with familiar pain, and waved his arms. "Get! You hear me? This ain't your home." Still, the horse remained, patient, unafraid, immovable as the ancient oaks that bordered the property. Over the following days, Harold tried everything to drive the animal away. He shouted. He threw rocks near its feet. Though he couldn't bring himself to actually strike the creature, he called the county animal control, but they said they were understaffed and would get to it when they could. He even put up a makeshift barrier at the edge of his property, a laughable construction of old pallets and chicken wire that the horse regarded with what Harold could only describe as amusement. But the black horse never left. He would graze in the overgrown pasture during the day, drink from the creek that ran along the eastern boundary, and at night he would stand near the farmhouse, his dark silhouette visible through Harold's bedroom window. It was unnerving at first, then irritating, and finally, inexplicably, comforting. Harold found himself talking to the horse, muttering complaints and observations as he went about his meager chores. "Fool animal," he'd say, scattering feed for the few chickens he still kept. "Don't know why you're wasting your time here. Nothing but an old man and his regrets." The horse would watch him with those knowing eyes, occasionally tossing his magnificent head, as if disagreeing. It was on the 12th night of the horse's presence that everything changed. Harold had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day of trying to repair the barn roof, a task that had proven far beyond his current strength. He'd fallen into a fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of Eleanor calling his name from somewhere he couldn't reach. He woke to the sound of hooves on wood. The black horse was on his porch, stamping and snorting with an urgency that sent Harold scrambling for his boots and jacket. When he opened the front door, the horse immediately began walking toward the forest, stopping after a few yards to look back. When in God's name, Harold whispered. The horse tossed his head and continued walking, pausing again, waiting, and against every rational thought, Harold followed. What was the black horse trying to show him? And what secrets lay hidden in the darkness of those Tennessee woods? The answer would shake Harold Beckett to his very core. The forest at night was a different world, a realm of shadows and whispers where familiar became strange and the darkness seemed alive. Harold hadn't ventured into these woods since he was a young man, back when he and his brother Samuel would hunt deer and set traps for rabbits. That was before the accident, before Samuel's name became something the family never spoke aloud. The black horse moved with purpose, navigating fallen logs and dense undergrowth as if he traveled this path 1,000 times. Harold struggled to keep pace, his lungs burning, his legs threatening to give out with each step. But something compelled him forward, a force he couldn't name, a pull that felt almost supernatural. "Where are you taking me?" he gasped. But the horse offered no answer, only continued deeper into the wilderness. The moon provided scant illumination through the canopy of leaves, casting everything in shades of silver and black. Owls called from invisible perches. Small creatures rustled in the underbrush. Harold felt like an intruder in a world that had forgotten humans existed, or perhaps had never wanted them there in the first place. After what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, the horse stopped. Harold nearly collided with the animal's hindquarters, catching himself on a nearby tree trunk. When he looked up, his heart stuttered in his chest. Before them stood a cabin. It was old, older than Harold, older perhaps than his father would have been. The logs were gray with age, the roof partially collapsed, the single window dark and hollow like an eye socket in a skull. Vines had claimed the structure, crawling up the walls and through gaps in the wood, as if nature itself was trying to pull the building back into the earth. Harold knew this place. Or rather, he had known it, decades ago, in memories he had buried so deep he convinced himself they were dreams. This was his grandfather's hunting cabin, the one that had been lost after the old man's death, the one Harold's father had forbidden anyone to speak of, the one that existed only in whispers and half-remembered childhood terrors. No, Harold breathed, stepping backward. This can't be. The black horse nudged him forward with a firm push of his muzzle, and then Harold heard it, a sound from inside the cabin, low, rhythmic, almost like breathing, or crying, or something in between that made every hair on his body stand at attention. He wanted to run. Every survival instinct screamed at him to turn around, to flee back to the safety of his farmhouse, to pretend this night had never happened. But the horse blocked his retreat. Standing firm and immovable, those ancient eyes fixed on Harold with an expression that seemed to say, "This is why I came. This is why I stayed. This is what you must face." Harold's hands trembled as he approached the cabin door. It hung partially open, the hinges rusted beyond repair, the wood soft with rot. The sound grew louder as he drew closer, definitely crying now, the kind of broken sobbing that spoke of profound grief or unbearable pain. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first, not decay as he'd expected, but something else. Dust and old paper and lavender? Eleanor's favorite scent. His chest constricted painfully. The interior was too dark to see clearly, but as his eyes adjusted, shapes began to emerge from the blackness. A table, chairs, a fireplace filled with cold ashes, and in the corner, on a makeshift bed of old blankets and straw, a figure, small, huddled, shaking with those heartbreaking sobs. Harold's fear transformed into something else, something that had lain dormant in him since Eleanor's death. Concern, compassion, the need to help another soul in distress. "Hello," he called softly, his voice steadier than he felt. "Is someone there? I'm not going to hurt you." The sobbing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Then a voice, small, trembling, unmistakably young. "Please, please don't let him find me." Harold's blood turned to ice. It was a child, alone in these woods, in this forgotten cabin, hiding from someone or something that terrified him beyond reason. He turned to look at the black horse, who stood in the doorway like a sentinel, watching with those knowing eyes. "What have you brought me into?" Harold whispered. The horse simply blinked and waited, because the journey was only beginning, and the secrets of this cabin ran deeper than Harold could possibly imagine. Who was hiding in that cabin? Who were they running from? And what did any of this have to do with a past Harold had spent a lifetime trying to forget? Harold moved slowly, carefully, the way one might approach a wounded animal. His eyes had adjusted enough now to make out more details. The cabin was filled with debris and forgotten relics, but the corner where the figure huddled had been cleared, arranged almost like a nest. Whoever this was had been here for more than just one night. "I'm not going to hurt you," Harold repeated, lowering himself to one knee despite the protest of his aging joints. "My name is Harold. I have a farm not far from here. Can you tell me your name?" Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with fear. Then, slowly, a face emerged from the shadows. A boy, no more than 10 or 11 years old, with dark hair matted with dirt and leaves, and eyes that held far too much terror for someone so young. His clothes were torn and filthy, his cheeks hollow from hunger, but with the bruises that made Harold's stomach clench. Purple and yellow marks on his arms, his neck, his jaw. Someone had hurt this child. Badly. Repeatedly. "I'm Eli," the boy finally whispered. "Please, mister, you can't tell anyone I'm here. He'll find me. He always finds me." Harold felt something crack open inside his chest. A door he had sealed shut years ago, behind which lived all the protective instincts he'd buried when Michael had abandoned him, when Eleanor had died, when he convinced himself he had nothing left to offer anyone. "Who's looking for you, son?" Harold asked gently. Eli's eyes darted to the doorway, where the black horse still stood watch. "My uncle, after my mama died, he took me in, but he's not a good man, mister. He drinks, and when he drinks, he gets mean, real mean." The words tumbled out now, a flood of pain that the boy had clearly been holding inside for too long. His mother had died 6 months ago. An overdose. Eli admitted with a shame that children who lose parents to addiction often carry. There was no father in the picture. Never had been. The uncle was the only family left, and the state had placed Eli in his care without much investigation. I ran away 3 times, Eli said, his voice breaking. They always bring me back. They say he's family. That family is what matters. But he hurts me, mister. And last time I thought he was going to kill me. So I ran far, real far, found this place and just stayed. How long have you been out here? Harold asked, horror mounting. I don't know. Couple weeks, maybe? I found some berries. Caught a fish in the creek once. But I'm so hungry, mister, and so cold at night. Harold closed his eyes, fighting the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. This child, this broken, terrified, abandoned child, had been surviving alone in the wilderness, while Harold sat on his porch feeling sorry for himself. While he wallowed in his own grief, this boy had been fighting for his life in a cabin less than a mile from his property. The black horse made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and Harold understood something in that moment with perfect clarity. The horse hadn't come to save Harold. The horse had come because Eli needed saving, and somehow, in some mysterious way that defied rational explanation, the animal had known that Harold was the one who could do it. Eli, Harold said, reaching out slowly until his hand rested on the boy's thin shoulder. I'm going to help you. I don't know exactly how yet, but I promise you, I swear on everything I have left, I'm going to keep you safe. The boy stared at him with disbelief, as if kindness were a foreign language he'd forgotten how to understand. Then, without warning, he collapsed forward into Harold's arms, sobbing against the old farmer's chest while Harold held him and let his own tears fall freely. Outside, the black horse stood guard as dawn began to break over the Tennessee hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, promising a new day, a new beginning. Harold carried Eli out of that cabin as the first rays of sunlight pierced the forest canopy. The boy was light, far too light for his age, and Harold's arms burned with the effort, but he didn't stop, didn't falter. The black horse walked beside them, occasionally nudging Harold's shoulder as if offering encouragement. The journey back to the farm took twice as long as the journey in, but finally, as the morning sun climbed higher, they emerged from the forest and Harold's farmhouse came into view. It looked different somehow, less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. But taking Eli in was just the beginning. The authorities would come looking. The uncle would not give up easily, and Harold was about to discover that protecting this child would require him to confront demons he'd buried for 50 years. The first 2 weeks with Eli were a revelation. Harold discovered reserves of energy he thought long depleted, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast, clearing out the spare bedroom that had once been Michael's, mending clothes and making trips to town for supplies he hadn't needed in years. The farmhouse, silent for so long, now hummed with life. Eli's tentative laughter, the clatter of dishes, the sound of footsteps other than Harold's own. The boy remained wary at first, flinching at sudden movements, apologizing constantly for the smallest infractions. Harold learned to move slowly, speak softly, give warnings before entering rooms. He learned that Eli had nightmares, terrible ones that left him screaming and drenched in sweat, and that the only thing that seemed to calm him was sitting on the porch, watching the black horse graze in the moonlight. They named the horse Midnight, though Harold suspected the animal had a name far older and more significant than anything humans could devise. Eli and Midnight formed a bond that was almost mystical to witness. The boy would spend hours brushing the horse's gleaming coat, whispering secrets into those alert ears, riding bareback through the pastures with a freedom and joy that made Harold's heart ache with bittersweet hope. But Harold knew this peace couldn't last. He hadn't reported finding Eli to the authorities, a decision that weighed on him heavily but felt necessary given what the boy had endured. He told himself he was protecting the child, giving him time to heal before navigating the nightmare of the foster system. But deep down, Harold knew he was also protecting himself from the inevitable loss when Eli would be taken away, from the emptiness that would follow. The storm arrived on a Thursday, Eleanor's Day, as Harold still thought of it, in the form of a black pickup truck that came roaring up the dirt road to his farmhouse. Harold was in the barn when he heard the engine. Eli was in the pasture with Midnight. Through the slats of the barn wall, Harold watched a man emerge from the truck. Tall, heavy-set, with a red face and the unmistakable swagger of someone who believed the world owed him something. "Hey!" the man shouted, his voice carrying across the property. "Hey, old man, I know you're here. I know you got my nephew." Harold's blood ran cold. This was him, Eli's uncle, the monster who had beaten a child and driven him to seek shelter in an abandoned cabin in the wilderness. The man's name, Harold would later learn, was Vernon Slater. He'd been searching for Eli for weeks, filing police reports, playing concerned guardian to perfection. The authorities believed him. Why wouldn't they? He was family. He had paperwork. He spoke the right words and made the right faces. Harold emerged from the barn, placing himself between Vernon and the pasture where Eli had frozen in terror, Midnight standing protectively beside him. "You need to leave my property," Harold said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. Vernon laughed, an ugly, mirthless sound. "Your property? Old man, you're harboring a runaway. That's a crime. Now give me back my nephew before I call the sheriff and have you arrested." "That boy isn't going anywhere with you," Harold replied. "I've seen the bruises. I've heard the stories. You'll have to go through me." Vernon's expression darkened, his hands curling into fists. "You don't know what you're getting into, old-timer. That boy is a liar. Always has been. Makes up stories for attention. His mama was the same way. Junkie and a liar, both of them." Behind Harold, he heard Eli whimper, heard Midnight stamp his hooves and snort with aggression. "Leave," Harold said again. "Now." Vernon took a step forward, and for a moment Harold was certain the man would attack him, but then something caught Vernon's attention, something over Harold's shoulder. The man's face went pale, his swagger faltering. Harold turned to see Midnight moving toward them, the black horse's massive form radiating a threat that needed no words. The animal's eyes were fixed on Vernon with an intensity that was almost supernatural, and for just a moment Harold could have sworn those dark eyes flickered with something ancient and terrifying. Vernon stumbled back to his truck, fumbling for the door handle. "This isn't over," he shouted as he climbed inside. "I'll be back with the sheriff. You'll see. That boy belongs to me." The truck roared away, leaving dust and threats in its wake. Harold turned to find Eli beside him, the boy's hand clutched tightly around Midnight's mane, tears streaming down his dirty face. "He'll come back," Eli whispered. "He always comes back." Harold knelt down and looked the boy directly in the eyes. "Then we'll be ready for him." But Harold had no idea what being ready would require, or what buried secrets would surface when he began fighting for Eli's future. Vernon Slater made good on his threat. 2 days after his visit, a sheriff's deputy arrived at Harold's farm with paperwork demanding Eli's return to his legal guardian. Harold refused, citing the abuse, showing the deputy the fading bruises on Eli's arms. The deputy looked uncomfortable but explained that without official documentation, without reports filed through proper channels, there was nothing he could do. "You've got 48 hours, the deputy said, not unkindly. "Get a lawyer. File an emergency custody motion. Something. Otherwise, I'll have to enforce the order." 48 hours. It wasn't nearly enough time, but Harold was determined to use every second. He started by visiting Ruth Calloway, the neighbor who had given up on him months ago. She answered the door with surprise that quickly turned concern when Harold explained the situation. By that evening, Ruth had mobilized half the church congregation, gathering donations for legal fees and spreading word about Vernon Slater's true nature. But it was Ruth who delivered the blow that would change everything. "Harold," she said gently, sitting across from him at his kitchen table while Eli slept in the next room, "there's something you need to know about that cabin in the woods, about your family." Harold's chest tightened. "What are you talking about?" Ruth took a deep breath. "My mother told me this story years ago, made me promise never to repeat it. But given everything that's happening, you deserve to know the truth." The story she told shattered Harold's understanding of his own history. 50 years ago, Harold's younger brother Samuel Haddon died in a hunting accident, as Harold had always been told. Samuel had been murdered, beaten to death by their father in a drunken rage, and buried behind the old cabin in the woods. Harold's grandfather had helped cover it up, and the family had maintained the lie ever since. Your daddy was a violent man, Harold. Ruth said softly. Everyone in Carter County knew it, but nobody talked about it. After Samuel died, your grandfather built that cabin as a kind of penance, I suppose. He'd go out there and sit for hours talking to Samuel's grave. And your daddy? He drank himself to death trying to forget what he'd done. Harold sat in stunned silence, memories rearranging themselves in his mind. His father's rages, his mother's fearful silence, the way Samuel's name had been erased from family conversations, the recurring nightmares Harold had suffered throughout his childhood, nightmares of a small boy crying in the dark, calling for help that never came. Why are you telling me this now? Harold managed to ask. Because Eli needs you to understand something, Ruth replied. The cycle of violence doesn't have to continue. Your father was abused by your grandfather. He became an abuser himself. Your brother paid the price. But you broke the cycle, Harold. You never raised a hand to Eleanor or Michael. And now you have a chance to save another boy from the same fate Samuel suffered. That night, after Ruth left, Harold walked out to the pasture, where midnight stood beneath a canopy of stars. The horse turned to regard him with those knowing eyes, and Harold finally understood. You knew, Harold whispered. You led me to that cabin because you knew what happened there. You knew about Samuel. Midnight stepped forward and pressed his great forehead against Harold's chest. Why? Harold asked, his voice breaking. Why show me this? Why bring Eli into my life? The answer came not in words but in feeling, a warmth that spread through Harold's body, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. He was not meant to die alone and forgotten. He was meant to break the chain, to be the protector that Samuel never had, to give Eli the future that had been stolen from his own brother. The next morning, Harold drove to town and hired the best lawyer he could afford, a young woman named Clara Davis who had a reputation for taking on impossible cases. He told her everything, about Eli, about Vernon, about the abuse, about his willingness to do whatever it took to keep that boy safe. Clara looked at him with sharp, assessing eyes. This won't be easy. Vernon has legal standing. You're a stranger with no blood relation to the child. I don't care about easy, Harold replied. I care about right. Something shifted in Clara's expression, respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. Then let's get to work. The battle for Eli's soul had begun, but Vernon Slater had secrets of his own, secrets that, when exposed, would shake the entire county to its core. The custody hearing took place on a gray November morning, 3 weeks after Vernon Slater had first appeared at Harold's farm. The courtroom was packed. Ruth and her church congregation filled one side, while Vernon sat alone on the other, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Eli sat beside Harold, dressed in new clothes Ruth had bought for him, his hand gripping Harold's with desperate strength. Midnight waited outside, tied to a post near the courthouse steps, refusing to be left behind. Clara Davis presented their case with precision and passion. She called witnesses who testified to Vernon's drinking, his violent outbursts, his history of arrests for assault. She presented medical records documenting Eli's injuries. She read a letter from Eli himself, describing in heartbreaking detail the abuse he had suffered. But it was Harold's testimony that turned the tide. He told the court about finding Eli in the cabin, about the boy's terror, his hunger, his desperate need for safety. And then, with a courage he didn't know he possessed, Harold told the story Ruth had shared with him. The story of his brother Samuel, of generational violence, of patterns that repeated unless someone had the strength to break them. I am 72 years old, Harold said, his voice steady as he addressed the judge. I have lost my wife, my son, my faith, and very nearly my will to live. I have nothing to offer this boy except a safe home, 3 meals a day, and a promise that no hand will ever be raised against him under my roof. I am not his blood. I am not his legal guardian. But I am the man who will protect him with my last breath, because 50 years ago, no one protected my brother, and I will not let another child suffer that fate. The courtroom was silent when Harold finished speaking. Even Vernon's lawyer seemed momentarily stunned. But the decisive blow came from an unexpected source. During a recess, the sheriff approached Clara with new information. Vernon Slater was wanted in 2 other states for fraud and assault. A woman in Kentucky had filed charges against him for beating her son, a boy who had been in his care as a foster child. The pattern was clear. Vernon took in vulnerable children for the government stipend, then abused them when no one was watching. The judge didn't hesitate. Vernon was arrested on the spot, his custody claim dismissed with prejudice. And in a decision that made the local news, emergency temporary guardianship of Eli was granted to Harold Beckett, pending a full adoption process. The drive home was quiet, but it was a silence of peace rather than fear. Eli sat in the passenger seat, watching the Tennessee hills roll past, occasionally reaching over to touch Harold's arm as if confirming the old farmer was real. When they arrived at the farm, midnight was waiting at the gate, though Harold was certain they had left him tied at the courthouse. The horse tossed his great head and walked alongside the truck up the driveway, escorting them home like a guardian returning warriors from battle. That evening, as the sun set over the hills in shades of gold and crimson, Harold, Eli, and Midnight stood together in the pasture. The boy had his arms wrapped around the horse's neck, his face buried in that gleaming black mane. Harold watched them with a heart so full it ached. "Thank you," Harold whispered to Midnight, or to God, or to Eleanor, or to whatever force had sent this magnificent creature into his life. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Midnight turned his head and regarded Harold with those ancient, knowing eyes. And just for a moment, Harold could have sworn he saw something there, a flicker of recognition, of purpose fulfilled, of a mission completed. The black horse had come when Harold was ready to surrender, had led him to a forgotten cabin and a forgotten truth, had helped him find not just Eli, but himself, the man he was always meant to be, buried beneath decades of grief and regret. As the stars emerged over the Tennessee hills, Eli looked up at Harold with eyes that no longer held fear. "Is this really my home now?" the boy asked. Harold placed his weathered hand on Eli's shoulder and smiled, his first genuine smile in years. "This is your home, for as long as you want it." And in the pasture, beneath the eternal stars, a black horse stood watch over his family, the lonely farmer who had found purpose, and the broken boy who had found peace. Their journey was just beginning, but they would face it together. Some say Midnight was just a stray horse who wandered onto a Tennessee farm, but those who knew the story really knew it, understood the truth. He was a messenger, a guardian, a bridge between despair and hope. He was the answer to a prayer Harold didn't know he was praying, and he stayed with them until the very end.